All right, so thanks for joining us today. We've got a few folks, more might enter later to talk about food systems. We've got Kyle here, who is a person who has had an urban farm, has done a lot of experimental work with food systems. George is studying to be a plant scientist at University of Georgia, right? And is going to bring some perspectives for that. And in our anonymous box, we've got someone who's under the age of 18, so it's good we're going to preserve their privacy. We hope that they will feel free to chime in on the conversation as we talk about like what it means as we're thinking about developing more resilience in our communities to deal with the food system. Right now, we know that we interact with a food system that is substantially global, that has potential weaknesses and a variety of supply chain issues, and that may not be meeting our needs in terms of biodiversity and climate issues. I'd like to hear what any of you have to say about that, just as a starting point, if that's resonant to you, or if you'd like to think about it in a little bit of different framing and direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of no secret right now that the way we produce food industrially is bad in terms of land use, definitely, and biodiversity. So doing something to change that would be great. Yeah.
Into
Just to
starting my
add in
own
terms,
farm?
oh, sorry, Kyle, go ahead, go ahead.
No, by all means.
No, I was going to talk about George, but we should talk about place in a bit. Let me stop being so interrupty.
I'm I'm confused. Where do you want me to start off with?
I'm just I'm going to mute myself again until you talk.
Okay. Okay, yeah, so the globalized food system and the more I learned about it was part of the reason that drove me to start my urban farm, right? Um and so I'm very passionate about the redevelopment of a localized food system, or at least a smaller regional food system. That way we have that resilience in the off chance that the globalized food system as it is can no longer continue.
Interesting to think about the globalized food system and what the global climate outlook implies for the globalized food system. Because it's not as if these equatorial bands that are particularly threatened in the global outlook are places that are not super involved agriculturally in the global food system. When I think about how the food system in the US has changed in the last 20 years. If anything, there's a dramatic increase in the availability and the daily use of tropical products. I have a tendency to harp on palm oil sometimes because of its enormous negative biodiversity impacts, but the amount of palm oil that's added as an additive to like everything has exploded over the last 10 years, it feels like. That we hear in the news. I mean, I've seen frequently about threats to like coffee and chocolate in the global supply chain. But I think this idea of tropical additives and the way that those are used to stabilize so many products that we might not think of as having that same sort of global impact is worth considering when we think about the merits of relocalizing food systems. And when we talk about relocalizing food systems in the context of change, it's really different to think about Iowa, where Kyle and I live, and to think about Georgia, where you are, George. Have you seen a lot of action on the ground as people are preparing for the changes?
I mean, yeah, to a certain degree. In my field, controlled environment agriculture, hydroponics, that kind of thing, we're seeing a lot of investment from companies like Plenty, Local Bounty. There's Aero Farms as well. They're investing along the East Coast and in the Southeast also specifically to produce food, where we have relatively cheap land. There's decent weather, at least right now. There's not as many water issues as you have out west. And when you can do agriculture in controlled environments, you can produce crops that you normally couldn't in that, locality. So you can grow strawberries in Georgia in the summer, because you can cool a greenhouse, or you can grow, lettuce in New York in the winter because you have lights and you heat the greenhouse, or, you have a vertical farm or something. So I think there's great potential in that kind of technology to help mitigate some of these issues that we're talking about.
It's interesting to think about when you think about the impact of extreme weather issues and hail events too, do you know anything about the sustainability or impact on that sort of growth system? Is that being assessed?
Yeah, it is. It's definitely hard to quantify because field production, we don't really adequately quantify the environmental costs of field production in super, high fidelity or anything like that. And then a lot of the benefits of, controlled environment agriculture are on the consumer side. So like things like longer shelf life, shorter food miles, those things are pretty hard to quantify as well. Yeah.
It is interesting to talk about these as being like hard to quantify problems. And you kind of allude towards the real costs. I've been thinking a lot about real costs of modern agriculture. We're into the sowing season out in the staple crop production that I live in, where we have corn and soy production. And it made the national news that there was a dust storm from someone sowing that made such a tremendous dust cloud over the highway. There was like an 80-car pileup. The visibility was just nothing.
Wow.
And yeah, there are plenty of people who have been out working in the fields kind of irrespective of the rain. And there have been just some enormous dust clouds. The lack of care for the soil in some operations is alarming. And you hear a lot of different figures about how many harvests we have left with this sort of treatment of the soil. When you're talking about a closed system, like a glass system on large scale, I don't mean to be like picking on you, but there's a couple of questions that I've had. One is, do you know what people are doing around soil nurturing in those systems, or is soil seen as like a inert commodity? And the second one is, how can we think about staple crops in that mindset? Because you're talking about table crops rather than staple crops, and I think we got to figure out how to handle both of them in changing conditions.
Yeah, definitely. So for the soil thing, what I do with hydroponics, we don't use soil in their traditional sense. So they're soilless systems. Inert substances like cocoa coir, or, even stuff like rock wool, and like, peat plugs, but delivering all the nutrients in a nutrient solution to the roots of the plants. I know people do use soil as well in greenhouse type systems, glass house systems, but that's not really what I do. So I can't speak to that super accurately. But yeah, and you're correct. I am talking about table crops because, again, that's also what I do. I know there's definitely work being done on soil health and stuff like that at the University of Georgia, definitely for soybean, because that's a big crop in Georgia. But also, peanuts as well, obviously, Georgia. And there are people that are looking at that, I'm pretty sure. But yeah, that's just not what I do.
Kyle, do you have any experience with soilless crops? I'm kind of interested in your perspective on this as someone who's worked to grow food locally at any kind of scale.
I don't have any experience with soilless media, just because I've always approached it from more of a permaculture lens, right? So I'm convinced that I'm a steward of the earth, and so more effort has to be put in on the front end in order to be able to take something back, right? So a lot of my doings was like loading up compost and leaves and any sort of organic material that I could into sites before I started planting and then taking from it. And I'd always make sure to add more nutrients than I was taking out, whether it be for tomatoes or lettuce or strawberries, right? It was about loading up on the front end so then I could receive a reward on the back end. I never I have grow lights for houseplants and stuff, but outside of that, that's only for the winter time. And then I take it all outside because my focus is on, you know, the outside, dealing with the environment and helping to enrich the environment.
So it's a couple of very different perspectives on food systems here. I have a lot of curiosity as to ways to move forward. I want to make sure we've got a raised hand here on our younger friend. Please take a moment. We'll clear the floor for you.
Oh, hi. I just wanted to ask if sometimes when some people are growing mushrooms, does that count as a type of soil if the substrate they're growing on is made out of coffee grounds or just leftover? Does that count as some sort of soilless crop? Mushrooms kind of like that?
Yeah, I think if it's not like technically soil, then it would be soilless. I know, a lot of people, I was talking to one producer who has a container farm over in Metter, Georgia, and he's looking into getting into mushroom farming in a container. And there's what is it? Like a peanut processing facility right near him that produces a bunch of waste, with the husks or from the plants or something like that. And he was trying to look into using, that waste from that production process as the substrate for his mushroom growing. So yeah, I think mushrooms definitely can be grown, like on coffee grounds or other organic substances in a soilless way, for sure.
On my property, at my place, I take a approach that is not about maximizing food production. When I look at my response to the changes around us, I see biodiversity as a major driver. And so when I'm choosing plants to put on my property, I'm often not thinking about food for me. I'm thinking about like, what is a weird bug going to eat and who would eat that weird bug, and trying to build up the trophic levels and seeing if there's ways that those kinds of systems can include my needs and my family's needs. So the type of system that I'm talking about is very small, and I realize it's not a whole systems approach. I'm trying to think about how to enrich a habitat so that it is productive in a way that refers to itself as well as other living things that may enter or leave the habitat, including me. Over the last few growing seasons, I've gotten a lot more table crop production, and it seems like as I'm able to nurture insect biodiversity, that I do get increased crop production kind of in a positive feedback loop, which is very different from the gardening practices that some people may have grown up with, where you're going to be using insecticides to try to limit your insect load in your yard. But it seems like if I can get enough guys who want to eat other bugs, that the situation stays more or less under control. That the problem isn't eliminating trophic levels, but adding trophic levels, if I'm allowed to be a little biologist-y on this. But I don't see this as that like everyone is going to have a yard that meets their caloric needs. I see it as that it's important to be creating sanctuary spaces for the many species that are facing population pressures. I mean, I think it's pretty evident the insect collapse even in North America. And I hear from friends in the Middle East and Europe who say that they don't even bother putting their screens in the windows anymore because the insect populations have gotten so low. When, Kyle, I can hear how the approach that you take to soil and to plants. Do you think much about other organisms in the system that you have?
Yeah, especially over the last few years, right? So my my home garden's about a 50-foot by 50-foot square. And so I started working on that in the tail end of 2020, I think, as I shut my farm down. And so I put in just a boatload of, well, not directly like table crops, but, more perennials in there, like elderberry, aronia right? Serviceberry, stuff that I can still process, along with our standard garden repertoire and additionally like native flowering plants. And I've seen, just as I continue to add to it, right, with the huge amount of leaves that I add to it and wood chips and such, as my soil becomes far more spongy, right, there's been an explosion. So this yard was traditionally grass with a small tomato patch in the back that was obviously sprayed because the soil was just dead all the time. And so as I've continued to add to this, right, not only has there been an explosion of various kinds of bugs, but additionally, now I'm getting quite a few garden snakes, which I don't see around my neighborhood. The garden snakes and the early flowering stuff also attracts bunnies, which then builds on it. Now all sorts of birds stop by on their migratory patterns because there's just not much else immediately around me, right? It's mostly small houses with small yards, all grass. There's a school with sterile bushes. But my yard has been, it's just become an explosion of all this different life. And as I continue to add to it, the life adds to it. And it's not like I'm getting a bunch of critters running into my house. They're all content. They all have their own environment outside. There's baby bunnies being born out there. There's, snake babies being born out there, and they're feasting on all the bugs that are out there. And it's just a symbiotic cycle of life, and it's good. It's good to have regular interaction with that on so many levels.
I'm jealous of the snakes. I've not seen many snakes on my property. I've heard from my neighbors that a lot of them have basement snakes, which is apparently just a normal term and thing to have in this area. And all the work I've put in, no snakes are living in my basement at all. It's very disappointing. I have to hope that in the next few years, maybe I'll be blessed with basement snake.
Once it starts, like I started getting garden snakes 2 years ago, and it's been specifically this spring, there's an explosion of garden snakes out there. And it's wonderful because I live next to an elementary school. So there's elementary kids walking by all the time. They get to examine it. And, occasionally I get to run out there and be like, hey, listen, let's be nice to animals. Let's treat them with respect. Let's learn about them,
I'm glad you're there for an intervention. But it is really good for children, for all people to have many of us don't have that adjacency to vibrant natural spaces. Many people, kids who grow up in an urban environment, I'm often surprised by how little knowledge they have of the natural world into their 20s and 30s. They may not be able to know the names of common species like robins or even ornamental flowers like the name of a violet. George, I want us to not be in a position where we could be interpreted as ganging up on you with the closed systems here. Because in a closed system, you have a different priority where you're trying to maximize and stabilize food production. Like we all have to acknowledge that we have to eat food, right?
Yep.
I wonder, is there a way that we can think about systems where we're able to knit this more into a picture of sustainability? You talked about this being done where land is cheap, but if this is in an enclosed system, could it be done vertically? Like we have all this commercial real estate, right, that no one wants to live in because the windows are too big and there's no bathrooms.
Yeah. So yeah, the two main categories of kind of controlled environment agriculture grow schemes, if you will, are greenhouses, where you're horizontal in your glass house and you primarily rely on the sun for your light, for your plants. And then there's the vertical farm, which is also indoor farm, sometimes as it's called. And that's when you stack vertically and you rely on artificial LED lights, or, there are different kinds of lights as well, but LED is more and more what people use. And it's completely enclosed. It's like a plant factory almost. And those can be done in a skyscraper type, like, stack them up in a city center type of way.
Maybe you can confirm, maybe you can't, but that's what they do in the Netherlands, right? Like the
Yes.
Netherlands
Well,
is a big food producer, but they're an indoor food producer.
yeah, they're a big hub for controlled environment agriculture broadly. I think they mainly do kind of the glass house type stuff, but they definitely do vertical farms as well. Japan is another big one, especially for strawberries.
Didn't know that at all. That's very interesting. I mean, Japan is very into local resilient food systems. I feel like when we look at the international picture, Japan is a standout in some ways. You know, they face challenges like everyone does, but their interest in producing local food really differentiates them from the challenges Great Britain is facing going into this next decade.
Sure. Yeah.
To me, some of the question comes down to land use. It seems to me that if we want to have resilience, which needs to include biodiversity, meaningful resilience, we have to think about land use and impacts on agriculture and ways to reduce our harmful impacts from agriculture. It seems like closed systems could contribute positively if we're able to think vertically in that way to reducing land use. But you say that right now it's mostly done in like a greenhouse system where land is cheap, right?
Yeah, well, it depends on the value of the land, right? So if land is cheap, then you can spread out and have a greenhouse because that's, lower overhead, lower capital cost up front. But whereas if land is expensive and you can only get a certain square footage, then you're going to want to go vertical if you want to produce, more, essentially. So,
You know, go back and forth philosophically. And it's all right if no one else resonates with this. I go back and forth between being like really furious to live in a world where I'm commodified and everything is commodified, and a desire that if we're going to be trapped in that system, to at least have it be accurately commodified, where we take into account sustainability and biodiversity costs into agriculture. Because when we're talking about wasteland, we are talking about land that has a different potential use, right? That has potential ecosystem services use. It's been very interesting to me in the 50 States Project to see where are we starting to see, I don't even want to say positive commodification, but like named commodification of these sort of ecosystem services. It's in the Dakotas. There are beginning to be state level programs to pay people for maintaining land that provides ecosystem services. Like so that the prairie pothole system doesn't just completely collapse and we lose all our ducks in the whole US. And in North Dakota, we also see a lot more progressive water monitoring and groundwater monitoring than we might expect. When we think about ecosystem services, and the value of ecosystem services. Do you guys see that as a part of moving forward as we try to think about different ways to form food systems?
yeah, I definitely share your kind of frustration a little bit with the commodification of everything and, the obsession with quantifying everything with a dollar value. That's like really frustrating. But, we already do that. So we might as well try and, make the business people, if you will, see a dollar value in these kinds of ecosystem services that you're talking about. Because if we can say, 1 acre of wild land produces $1 billion in ecosystem value or whatever, the business people are like, oh yeah, okay, let's not develop it. Okay, that's valuable, right?
It's like if we can't decommodify, we need to at least accurately commodify.
Definitely.
It is it seems like many people, just like regular people that you talk to, are becoming aware of the fact that we are having ecosystem services problems as they notice fewer bugs. Kyle, I don't know how many people even had vertebrates to lose, over the last 20 years that they could think of their home as a place where there's going to be other vertebrate life forms.
Yeah, it's fascinating just how much, at least for where I live, how much less insect life there is within my own lifetime. I'm only 30, and there's been a huge decrease that you can physically see in the Midwest. Yeah, there has to be some value to it, and there has to be ecosystem surrounding where food production is. Otherwise, you're forced to bring in additional pollinators and stuff. There's a complete disconnect there with how food production should work and how it's worked for tens of thousands of years for us.
I think that looking back on those kinds of systems is important. And that's something that really troubles me often when I hear people talk about sustainability and wilderness in the US. It's not like there were these unmanaged, pristine systems at the time of colonization, right? Like we're talking about vibrant human managed landscapes, humans who are using fire, who are using bison, who were doing selective planting, who were doing generational work to make these rich food producing landscapes. It feels like the myth of wilderness is another way that we erase indigenous history and contribution. And I think that it's kind of weird that we focus on like this wilderness mindset of conservation rather than like a garden mindset of conservation, if that makes any sense.
Yeah,
I'll
totally.
agree with you there.
Yes.
It's true, because the Native Americans, as we can tell, right, manage these regional landscapes to produce food on their travel paths. And that really boils down, if you think about it, as we commodify everything, with similar to food, right? There's apple farms, whereas we could have apple trees lining the major highways. We could have pecan alleys, right, that you run goats through right next to where people mainly travel, so that during times of the year you can just go pick up food. It's what was done, but it's just no longer done, right?
It's weird how resistant some people are to picking food that they find in the wild. I remember I was in high school and there was this line of old apple trees behind the high school, and I would go and eat them because they were great. And people, it was like a real division in my friends who was willing to eat the mystery apples and who wasn't.
Yeah, I
It's
mean, one of my favorite things to do is like, pick up a random plant or something when I'm on a hike with my friends and be like, hey, watch, you can eat this. They're like, ah.
So you've seen this too. You've seen this
Yeah.
too, that people are
Yeah.
frightened by the idea that food does not come from the store, that
Mhm.
food can be existing, much as we see in many of our favorite video games. Sometimes it's just a map resource.
Yeah.
I love the idea of public silviculture, public tree culture, Kyle. I think that's so applicable for so many of the types of communities that we'd like to live in, walkable communities. As we move to a hotter, drier future, the tree canopy is going to be really important for the quality of life in communities. George, I mean, you're in Georgia. You know how much money they're putting into the tree canopy in Georgia.
Yeah, well, and I went to college down in Orlando, and there's not a lot of trees in, suburban/urban Orlando, and it was hot. And I'm from Tallahassee, which is similar climate to Orlando. It's a little bit cooler, but there's way more trees in Tallahassee, so it was way cooler. So, if you can combine the benefits of having a tree canopy with also, food production, fruit production, that's just like simple win-win. Like that seems like an easy decision to me. I don't know.
I've seen it done in some European communities that have traditional tree production. Like in parts of Spain where they have old orange trees everywhere. They
Valencia,
had
yeah.
did you see the video that was so viral last year with the Valencia orange picking equipment?
Yeah, where they just go around and they shake the trees and the oranges fall everywhere and nobody's rushing to pick them up. Like, yeah.
I like the specialized equipment. I know that may not be the most sustainable path forward, but I do have a love of just weird trucks. Like they're fun, they're funny. And it's that is a thing that is true about the videos is that people don't want to pick up the oranges.
They look super tasty. I mean, I don't know.
Never thought about that, but you're right. No one's going for them.
They just like they're rolling everywhere. It's on the ground. And I'm like, guys, those look good. No.
It's interesting to think about the kind of mindset change as part of relocalizing food systems. Like it can't just be a technical problem. It has to be a problem where people want to engage with and maintain systems where they are. I think that when we talk about calories and the need to supply calories for a human habitation at anything like our current population density, you got to be talking about a mixed methods approach going forward, right? But when we talk about the mindset and the value of life, it seems like the community as garden, the landscape as garden, a type of permaculture approach where you have a relationship with place, and part of that includes mutual nourishment, would be a very healthy direction to be moving. Please chime in.
Oh, I was just thinking on the topic of how like some people might be afraid of getting, I guess, wild vegetables or any plants like that. I wonder if it might change because, okay, I should not be worrying about this since I'm still in 11th grade, but if there was, I guess, a bit more economic difficulty or if just like things are getting a bit more expensive, if that attitude might change. I mean, I do know that there are a bunch of cherry trees where I live and apple orchards near an office building, and sometimes I see some people picking at it because they're free, but I wonder if as things go along, if there might be a change in like the general attitude of most people.
That's a really interesting point to think about as we think about potentially transitioning from like the crazy abundance of modern industrial agriculture to potential scarcity, which is like, the last, is it 4 tomato harvests have been poor out of California, and it's likely that the commercial tomato products are just going to be less available and more expensive going forward, is what I've read from that industry. I wonder how many people have family knowledge of engaging in foraging type behaviors. This spring, I picked a lot of dandelion greens to try to convince my family to eat them. I thought they were pretty good. And I did it based on hearing family stories from in the 30s of engaging in that sort of like subsistence foraging outside of Chicago. Like my grandpa in the 30s would go out and shoot rabbits outside of Chicago and bring them home on the L under his suit jacket, right? Which it does seem like a thing that could still happen in Chicago today, honestly. But how many of us, I wonder, proportionally have these sorts of food traditions that would make it seem accessible? Because if you can't name a robin or a violet, how do you know what's okay to eat out there? Even if you see it and it looks kind of familiar.
I can just chime in that yeah, this is all education based, right? I consider myself like a pretty standard I came from a middle class background, very suburban. Like there was no education that I had in understanding what was around my landscape. And it's only been in the last, 6 or 7 years that I've really taught myself what's happening around, when stuff's good, and that knowledge that I've gained has really led to a level of self-resilience that I have. I know what time of year I'm going out to go pick a bunch of mulberries. I know what time of year I'm going out to go harvest a bunch of pecans. I know where they are in my region, right? And since I've learned that, I feel way more comfortable going out and doing that. And as I teach other people, like, hey, do you know it's mulberry season? Do you want to come pick some with me? It helps empower them because it's a free resource and you can't find food for free in this day and age, right?
I
It's
love it
definitely
that
something
you like teach people, that you get people to come out with you with that.
well, yeah, because I'm really passionate about empowering those around me, right? Um, Especially those of lower socioeconomic status, because I'm right there with them. It helps out, but it's definitely a lack of connection. There's the lack of knowledge, and then how many generations back is there? Let alone how many generations is there knowledge, right? Because often I'm friends with a lot of people that are children of divorce and their parents were divorced, and there's very, very little generational knowledge passed down after those traumas.
Well, and I think in our modernity, people tend to move towns, regions, more, between generations. So, if your grandparents didn't grow up where you live, then, you're not gonna even have the opportunity to have that generational knowledge of your location and, the plants in your area, that kind of stuff passed down just because, you're new there. So, yeah.
Anonymous, please chime in.
Oh, sure. I guess all this topic about like local knowledge, it suddenly like it reignited a memory of a very old National Geographic article that I once read. Um, the good thing is that I think National Geographic they made it so that the link is online. So would it be okay if I pasted it in the chat room?
Yeah, please.
That'd be great. I'm gonna make sure that I copy it so that I don't lose it, and I'll put it in the description when I upload this, okay?
All right, sure, thank you. And I guess it was like really significant because as I was reading back, I remember when I was like, what, 10 years old or something, reading about how this family in rural Iowa, even though they were kind of malnourished because benefits only go so far, but they managed to kind of like start planting sweet corn to look into the library, to look at foraging mushrooms and stuff like that, which I thought that was really interesting because I don't know about others, but to me, there's something about like foraging for wild mushrooms that always sounds really fun. Um, but I guess like the article, sorry, I'm also reading, it's talking about like there's just not a lot of knowledge and some people like they do need to stretch out money is a big issue and especially for like areas which doesn't have enough food where things it's a bit scarce.
You can definitely be in an area where it is not super accessible to get commercial food, where if you know local foodways, it can be more easy to get seasonal food than commercial food in rural Iowa. It's about 25 minutes for me to get to a grocery store where I am now, but 5 or 10 minutes to get to a variety of less conventional food sources. I like the point that you made about displacement from like bioregion. It made me think a lot, remembering when I went to Arizona. So when I was starting grad school, I started at Tulane and I had wanted to live in New Orleans for a long time. I had very romantic notions of it and I liked it a lot there. And after I'd been there and was like 6 weeks into my lab, we got hit by Katrina, which was a disruptive element to my education. And I went back and I volunteered to help clean up the medical school, which is a thing no one should ever volunteer for. It's one of my best mistakes ever. And my lab eventually moved to Arizona. And being in this radically different environment where I no longer knew like any of the plants. And I'd prepared for moving to New Orleans, both from studying the plants of the region explicitly and implicitly through like my New Orleans cultural obsession, where people write about the plants in different books. And that feeling of displacement was so jarring that it has driven me back into the Midwest, where I feel more able to like connect to my lived experience and to stories that have been passed down in my family that's been in the Midwest for quite a while. It's no, if most places have a way that you can access that kind of education. And that might be a cool thing to think about growing out of this conversation is putting together some resources about accessing the edible plants of an area or what sort of semi-wild plants, because a lot of like the apple that you might forage is not exactly a wild plant. It's just plants somebody put in for cider 100 years ago, right?
Yeah.
With you being like, sorry, please go on, please go on.
Yeah, and then like, just like all over the South, you have brambles, blackberry, raspberry. They just grow wild, and people just don't know that. And you can just pick them and eat them, and they're great. They're often better than what you can get at the store. So
That is a food that I will bother people until they eat, is the wild blackberries. I feel like you can get people to push through their discomfort and they're going to have a pretty good experience with that one.
definitely.
But Kyle, if you're collecting nuts, like with pecans, you have to be processing as well. Did you teach yourself how to do that?
Actually, I learned through another permaculture nursery kind of nearby me, who has the processing. He's got like the nutcrackers and everything. He's the one who taught me how to deal with them because he stores just an enormous amount of them.
They're like a really awesome food source. I mean, the fat profile in those things is incredible.
Nuts, very calorie dense, like very fatty, very filling, last forever. They're great. They're a great staple crop. If corn and soy really tanked, nuts will always be there.
That is a point that I'm so glad that you said. I don't know if I've ever really talked about it with anyone, is the thought of if you're looking at like a Midwestern forest landscape, there are non-grain pathways towards hitting people's caloric needs. And I feel like we're in a food system where we don't even consider non-grain pathways. We don't even consider tree-based pathways for food. And like with nuts, it seems pretty doable. I don't know what it would feel like to eat nuts as your staple calorie. That would be a weird experiment.
I think
George, I can see
personally,
you're getting
I
into
think it
it
would
too.
change a lot.
I'm
Yeah, well,
sorry,
I'm just happy.
the
I'm just happy
audio
you guys
didn't
are
come.
talking up pecans because, like, Georgia, go dogs. Grow a lot of pecans around here.
Kyle, you said something and we couldn't hear it. The audio didn't go through on the thought experiment of eating only nuts.
No, I actually just recently saw something about how our softer foods have led to the kind of the tooth think if we actually did transition to that, we would all have much stronger jaws and much straighter teeth. It's an interesting thought process.
Is an interesting thought process. And it is interesting as we think about the climate future for southern parts of the US, for the southeastern United States. Because as we're talking about this warm night challenge that the Southeast is facing, we are pretty far into our understanding of how that's going to foobar conventional row crops.
Um.
But I go ahead, please say.
Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to. Oh, all right. Thank you. I was just wondering, since the Southeast will have like a really big heat up, I was always wondering if there could be like incorporation of, I guess, crops grown in, I guess, Latin America, where there's a lot more plantains, there's a lot more beans, more legumes, crops like those. Maybe that could help transition.
Oh, I think it's going to be huge. I think that we're going to see a lot more sorghum in the US and other hot weather crops like that. We are in a fortunate position in the US that there are well tested hot weather crops that could be moved in over the next 10 or 15 years. how much research has been done on the warm night impact on trees, on fruit and nut trees? That's not something that I've considered before. I'm going to look it up. I'm going to see what that would mean. I think there's a lot of people who are interested in permaculture and wild food systems who'd want to hear the answer to that.
Yeah, that would definitely be a question for a forestry or a tree physiology type person. But yeah.
It's also a good question for academic databases, because this seems like a pretty searchable problem if I can get into it through the university database. That transition in your area, George, where there really is going to be some staple crop transition, it requires some bold problem solving to handle. We're fortunate in the part of the Midwest that I'm in and that Kyle is in. We're not going to see such a huge projected change in plant hardiness zone. The summers are going to be rough. There's going to be a major increase in days over 86 and longer droughts. But the fact that we're keeping some of the cold in the winter, that we're keeping some of the lows, really makes mature plants have a better shot at fighting it out than the older plants, the older like heavy bearing plants having a better shot at fighting it out. But it's cool to see someone, from Florida in Georgia getting ready to get in the fight in that area.
Yeah, that's the idea.
It's really cool. What do you want to do? What's your goal with your current education?
I think I would like to work in hydroponic food production, like controlled environment, food production at the commercial scale.
It'll be interesting to see how much more of that comes to the US as the economics change and as some of the places that we've overutilized, like the Central Valley and around Yuma in Arizona, where they've essentially taken a hydroponic approach but destroyed a desert ecosystem in the meanwhile.
Yeah.
Now that we've cashed that out, I hope we can move forward in a less brutal way. What's going on, Anonymous?
I guess on the topic of education, I was kind of wondering if you guys had any experience kind of being in, sorry, I don't know a lot, but I guess like biotechnology hubs, like the Research Triangle in North Carolina, those places, if they could also be centers of like food innovation and stuff like that.
There's definite like parallels. So I was at the Biodesign Institute at ASU for my graduate work, and they did a lot of really interesting research, the lab next to me, on biofuel production, where they were using genetically modified algae that had a lot of fat in them to make like a sun-grown biodiesel. And I know that there are other biotech centers that are also focused on biotechnology, sustainability issues. I don't know anyone who's doing direct food science. I know more about people in the energy sector, just personally.
Yeah, I mean, I know NC State has a great agriculture program. I think they have some controlled environment people. Ohio State is a huge one. Chiri Kubota up there. She's done a lot of the pioneering work, especially for strawberries here in the United States for hydroponic strawberries. And then, UGA, we're getting up there, hopefully. Yeah,
I
that's
have heard a
about the
lot
extent of my
about both of them. They both have a great reputation. In Iowa, if you're interested in food systems, Iowa State University in Ames is world famous for work that they've done. And they're doing a lot to try and find ways to make current row crop production more sustainable. They're really pushing the prairie strip method, which they've been testing for a while, which is relevant to what Kyle was talking about with having natural areas that are interspersed with agricultural areas so that you have pollinator habitat and biodiversity habitat as part of an agricultural system where they're not as distinct. And that's been shown to be really helpful for erosion control related to soil and water quality issues. There are a lot of places that are doing great work on this. And I think that we need to be throwing a lot of spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks. It seems like one thing we can agree on is that the current systems are not going to get us where we need to go. And I am aware that my bug focused personal path forward may not be entirely scalable. So I've enjoyed having this opportunity to talk with everyone here. And George and Kyle, you present such different and interesting perspectives. This has been a really cool conversation. Does anyone want to say any like final words as we get ready to close out? This has been a cool hour.
I'll just add in there was an earlier point about finding out about your local bioregional like foraging opportunities. I found great resources in older market gardeners, like just going to local farmers market, finding old ones that look like they should have retired many years ago, and becoming friends with them, because they're, at least around where I am, all the local market gardeners are 80, 90 years old and still going, and they're just wealths of information about what's happened over the last 90 years.
Oh, I love that. That's so true to my experience. My friends in their 80s are awesome friends. You learn all kinds of weird and unexpected stuff from them.
And then I guess I'll jump in on the other side there. I think, recruiting the next generation is really important too. So getting involved with like elementary school gardens. So, kids grow up knowing what a tomato plant looks like, or knowing, what the food that they eat every day looks like, so that they're not afraid to try new things and they feel more connected to the earth. I think that's really important as well. So, on the flip side.
It would be beautiful if by the time we are in our 80s and 90s on this call, if we did not have to like double dog dare our companions as hard to eat natural or found foods, if that was a more normal thing for us to interact in a mutual way with the landscapes in which we live. That would be a cool direction to be able to move forward in. All right, well, I'm going to turn off this recording. Thank you all for talking. I think this was cool. I think this was a fun hour, and I hope we'll be able to talk again